everybody. That was very enthusiastic. I am so glad that you have all chosen to spend an hour in this room together tonight. I'm talking slowly and loudly, waiting on the conversation. There we go. Welcome, you all. Welcome to our, technically our third Sexuality, Gender, and Faith Forum. If you include the introductory forum, you may remember last month we gathered in this space and heard from Dr. Bill Leonard and Marv Knox on the history of issues related to sexuality, gender, faith, and marriage in the Christian tradition. And we learned about some case studies from different churches in our Baptist fellowship that have engaged in similar conversations to the learning process that we're in at Greystone right now. Tonight we have a different topic. Tonight we are learning from two NC State professors. You may be tempted to call one of them by name because she may have grown up here. But tonight, even though the person that will be on the stage might look like Annie, we will be hearing from Dr. Hardison-Moody and from Dr. Maru Gonzalez, her colleague. They are both social scientists and NC State professors with areas of expertise in gender and sexuality. Their full bios are available on our website, so you can read more about them there. And I know that you will join me in welcoming them in just a moment for tonight's topic, which is centering around what we know about sexuality and gender from a social sciences perspective. Before we begin officially tonight, though, I would like to light our candle, which is our ritual practice, reminding us of God's presence with us in this space. So I'm going to do that right now. Let's take a moment of silence. Recognizing that God is here with us, among us, and within us, let's begin with our practice of breath prayer, which, remember, helps us to quiet our minds, to calm our hearts, to notice the things that are happening in our bodies, where we're tense, where we're not. The practice enables us to stay present in our bodies tonight, to pay attention to when we become tense or when we respond to information that we are hearing. And this practice enables us to safely discharge the energy that remains, right? So it helps us become aware of our bodies. So let's take 60 seconds and practice that breath prayer where we breathe in and breathe out, seeking awareness and asking for God's presence to be as near as the air in our lungs. God, we thank you for joining us in this space tonight. Open our hearts, our minds, our bodies, and our souls to your movement among us. In all things, we give you thanks, we give you praise, and we trust you. Amen. Okay, well, let me turn it over to Dr. Hardison-Moody to begin tonight's presentation.
Hi, everyone. So we are so excited to be here with you tonight to talk about gender and sexuality from a social sciences perspective. And the way that we're going to do this is I'm going to talk for the first part about kind of some basics around sex, gender, and sexuality. And then Maru is going to talk about her research and work around youth development and belonging. And then we're going to kind of pull it all together by thinking about belonging and faith. So take it away, Jonathan. Yes. Is that okay for you to? Yeah. All right, so here's what we're going to be talking about tonight. Our agenda, we're going to talk about what is gender. We're going to kind of break down gender binaries. We're going to think about how we know what we know in the cycle of socialization, moving us into thinking about youth development and thriving and belonging. So that's our agenda. And if you'll move us forward, thank you. So I can pull up the slides later on. Yeah, for you. Okay. So tonight in this first half, what I would like to convey to you all is a couple of things. The first is that there is a distinction between sex, sexuality, and gender. Oftentimes we conflate those categories, but they are actually distinct things. And so we need to break them down and feel comfortable knowing how to use the term that's specific to what we're talking about. And number two is to think about how we've set up very binary understandings, so that two binary understandings for understanding things like sex, sexuality, and gender. But how in reality, when we look at people's lives, when we look at actual data, people are really more complicated than a binary system. And then number three, I want us to think about the processes of socialization that shape how all of us think about and experience sexuality and gender. Oftentimes, conversations about sexuality and gender, particularly among cisgender, so people who identify as the same gender as the sex they were assigned at birth, or people who might say they're straight or heterosexual, conversations about sexuality and gender tend to be pushed off. So we're talking about people who are LGBTQ+, but actually all of us have gender, all of us have and experience sexuality. So this is an all of us conversation, and we've all been socialized to understand things about sexuality and gender. So let's get started. We know from decades, and I've got notes here because I want to be very specific about things that I'm talking about, and if you know me, sometimes I'll wander, so I'm looking at my notes tonight. So we know from decades of human development research that who we are and who we come to be, our identity, our sense of self, is formed in relationship. None of us is born just being exactly the person that we are today. So our primary relationships when we're born, those with our caregivers, with our immediate family, the people who take care of us, those are those primary attachments that begin to form our identity and our development. But then as we grow, it's those relationships with peers, with our family, with our religious community, and with the broader world that shape how we think about ourselves and our identity and our development. And so children's identity is really shaped by this broader community, by the broader world, and the interactions with people around us. The things that people do, the interactions that we have with them, and how people react back to us. And this is the same when we think about sex and gender, right? So does anybody know what this image is? Have you ever seen anything like this before? A gender reveal, right? And so when someone is pregnant, often the first question that people ask them is, what are you having? So even from before the time someone is born, we are questioning and we are assigning and understanding something about their gender, or trying to understand something about their gender. So we start thinking before they're born about how people are socialized into their gender. For example, as you can see here, we separate babies that, we separate blue for boys and pink for girls. And what are some other ways, just call those out, that you all see how that we do that with babies, like babies, children. Trucks and dolls. Trucks and dolls, yes. You can see it in the toy aisle very easily. What was tears and no tears? Yes. Who's allowed to have what kinds of emotions? Those are very gendered kinds of conversations. What other? Hair bows. Yes. So lots of parents will put a bow on their girl baby because they want people to be able to identify that baby as a girl. So we often conflate gender with biology, with how people are born or the body parts that they have, but it's actually something that we create as a society. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. But what that means is that our understandings of gender are shaped by the society and the culture and the place and the unique context that we are in. So understandings of gender have changed over time. They have changed, and they're different in different cultures as well. So we're going to start breaking down those terms. And first we're going to talk about, if you'll go to the next slide, what is gender and how is it related to sex? So often we conflate those terms, sex and gender. But sex is something that is usually assigned at birth, and it's based on usually bodily and chromosomal characteristics. And those can begin as early as fertilization. So someone could have a sex assigned at birth as female or as male. And often with sex, we think about that as two categories. So I talked about how we're going to kind of break down understandings of binary understandings of sex. But in actuality, 2% of the population is intersex, which is about 1 in 100 Americans. So people who are intersex, and I'm going to use the Cleveland Clinic's definition here, have reproductive or sexual anatomy that doesn't fit into an exclusively male or female binary sex classification. And so this might be identified when someone is born, but it might not be until people hit puberty or even in adulthood that people understand or realize that they are intersex. Maybe you're going in for a diagnostic test, or maybe you're going in for a surgery and you realize, and the doctor might realize this. So again, although we want to think about sex itself, like often we think that, well, that's science and that's biology, sex itself isn't actually binary. We have different understandings and different kinds of bodies and different kinds of people that fall between those categories that we've identified as male and female. So if you'll go to the next slide. So now that we understand, and this is like super, super crash course. So Maru and I have put together a list of resources as well, because this is very condensed, but to give you all a sense of sex gender. So now that we understand a little tiny bit about how that classification of sex works, let's think about what gender is and how those two things are related. Because gender is often also understood as a binary as well, male and female. So when the little baby comes out, we wrap her in a pink blanket or we put a blue hat on him. But as we've just talked about with sex, gender isn't an easy binary either. And over time, our understandings of gender and what gender is have changed a good deal. And that's what we mean when we as social scientists would talk about gender being a social construct. It's something that we have worked out together in society, in community, in different cultures. But it doesn't mean that it's not real, right? It doesn't mean that because something is socially constructed that it doesn't have real impacts on people's lives, or that it doesn't shape how we live our lives. So as you can ask anyone who steps outside of particular gender norms or the ways that we've understood things like masculine and feminine, if the impacts of that socialization or that social construct isn't real. And in some cases even deadly for people who are outside those constructs. But it does mean that how we think about things as static, like sometimes we think about things like male or female identity as static, as if they've always existed the way that we understand right now what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman. They've actually changed a good deal over time. And they're very different in different places. So for example, if we think about just one historical example, but I'm sure that you all could come up with lots of them. In the 1700s in France, it was perfectly normal and the very height of fashion for men to wear high heels, tights, wigs, makeup. But you think about our norms of masculinity right now in the United States, and those things are not the same. So that's what I'm saying, where it changes over time. And how we come to understand what femininity, what masculinity is, those things have changed over time and in different places. You can go to the next slide. And learning about, this is kind of hard to see, But learning about our gender is itself also a social process. So as I said earlier, our identity is formed in relationship. So from the time of, the very early, babies, we start to interact with the world around us, and we receive feedback from the people around us, the people who are in our lives. So we receive positive reinforcement about how we're acting. We might receive some negative reinforcement about how we're acting. That larger world that we're in plays a big part in shaping how we understand ourselves and our gender. And this diagram is by Anne Fausto Sterling, who is a biologist who's been studying the intersections of sex and gender for a long time. And I put a link in the end of this. We're going to link to some resources to her website, which has some great additional videos that you can view. But I want you all to just pause for a minute now and think about your own gender socialization. So again, this is about all of us. We've all learned things from growing up about who we are and about what our gender is. And think about how you were socialized to understand what gender was, what your gender was. I'm guessing that for a lot of us in this room, it might have had to do with religious upbringings, right? Or it might have had to do with how your family understood things, what was good or what was proper or what was right. And I want you to think for a minute about how that felt, how it felt to come to understand who you were. Or have you thought about it before? Maybe you haven't. Maybe this is the first time where you're thinking about, I don't really know how I learned about gender. So we don't have time tonight for you to kind of sit and process and think, but start to ask that question. And I would say maybe in your small groups, that could be a good question to explore together, of thinking about how you were socialized to understand what gender was. So we can see that, like sex, gender is really not easily mapped onto binaries, that people fall along a continuum. And so that's the kind of the reality of how we understand gender. People might have particular traits, they might have particular expressions, and depending on how people's interactions with their broader world is, certain traits might be more or less they might become more or less a part of your identity and who you are. So I do want to talk about, because I know that folks have had questions about some questions about what it means to be transgender and what it means to be non-binary. So if you'll go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about that. Quoting here from the National Center for Transgender Equality, transgender is a broad term that can be used to describe people whose gender identity is different from the gender they were thought to be when they were born. And oftentimes people use the word trans to be shorthand for the word transgender. And some folks who are trans, or some folks might identify instead as non-binary, so as neither male or female, or identifying as both male and female. Of US adults, about 2% of the population identifies as trans or non-binary. And as you can see here from this on the left, this chart on the left from the Pew Research Center, more young adults identify as transgender than older adults. And we're going to see some similar stats when I talk about sexuality in just a little bit. There's a good reason for this data difference. As with a lot of things that have been maybe taboo topics or things that we don't talk about in our society, once people feel more comfortable naming or claiming whether it's an experience or a part of their identity, we can see increases in that kind of data being reported. Another example of this is for example, intimate partner violence and sexual assault. As reporting or talking about experiences of intimate partner violence have become less stigmatized in terms of reporting those things, even though it's still incredibly stigmatizing often for people to report, we have seen increases in data in reporting because people feel less shame or they feel less stigma about identifying themselves or an experience that they had. So similarly, it's not surprising to see that as younger people are growing up in a world that is a little bit more open, although again, as Maru is going to talk about, still incredibly hard, especially for trans and non-binary youth, more young people are willing to report, or they feel comfortable, or they see a category that describes their particular experience. So people might see data like this and say, well, all this talk about gender is turning kids trans. When in fact, we see this in data across lots of different things, that as we start to talk about something, people reporting increases, but that doesn't mean the actual thing is increasing. It means people feel more comfortable actually reporting it. So the fact is that trans people have always existed, and and we have incredible historians doing amazing work right now recovering trans history. One of those is this book called True Sex that I really loved. And it outlines how trans men actually lived and were accepted as farmers, as husbands, as valued community members, and men at the turn of the 20th century in the United States. And this historian has recovered these accounts of newspaper clippings of when these men died, that their community found out that their community found out that they were assigned female at birth. And what was even more remarkable in what this historian found is that the articles after the community had found that out came out lauding these men as wonderful husbands and community members and valued leaders in their community. And so, again, like, this recovery of trans history helps us to see, like, even though I think in the news sometimes we are presented as if, like, this is a new phenomenon, we might have new names for things, and it might be that people feel more comfortable being who they are, but there are incredible histories that tell us that this is not new. For example, Native American communities have a gender category of two-spirit. And there have always been underground communities or places where people have found respite and solace and care and community when the broader outside world is not accepting of them, particularly trans and queer people have found love and acceptance and community in places when they've been stigmatized from the rest of the community. So again, people might not have seen these communities, but it's because you weren't a part of them or you didn't know, because people had to be, be separated because of discrimination and experiences of violence. And so that's a picture of the one on the right. You can't really see very well, but it's of, like, my favorite show in the world, Pose, and if you haven't watched it, it's fantastic. Okay, next slide. So this is an image that I love to show my students in our human sexuality class, because we've talked a little bit, or I've given you a little bit about how sex and gender are different but related, and that connects to sexuality. And so the last part of my talk, I'm going to talk about sexuality, but this is called the gender unicorn. And what's particularly important to note here is that you can see with the gender unicorn that a person's identity might be different from how they express themselves. And that expression or identity might be different from the sex that they were assigned at birth. And that might be related to or might not be related to their physical and emotional attractions. So again, we oftentimes want to conflate all of these things and try to understand them as one, but it's very helpful to understand that there might be reasons why people's expression is different from their identity. Maybe they don't feel comfortable, or they're not in a community where that can be the case. Or there might be other reasons why there are differences, or why those things are different. So if you'll go to the next slide. And again, this is a super crash course in studying sexuality, but if we think about the study of sexuality, which up until kind of the modern period was the domain of religion and the church, but then sexuality became something that was studied and even regulated through scientific and medical communities and by scientists, and in many different disciplines from psychology to biology. So there are all sorts of people studying sexuality and understanding sexuality from these varied traditions and disciplines. But one thing that I do want to tell you all about today is that one person who helped us to think about the diversity of sexuality in the US is Alfred Kinsey, and you all might be familiar with Kinsey's work. But he interviewed thousands of people across the US to try to understand their relationships and sexual behaviors and practices. And he was doing this in 1947. So But what he found was that sexual behavior and practice fell along a continuum or a spectrum. So it was not a binary of heterosexual and homosexual, but when you look at people's actual experiences and behaviors, that people fall along a spectrum. And so again, this is based upon thousands and thousands of people and interviews that he did, although it has to be noted that these were with white, college-educated folks, although the Kinsey Institute has since, they do a national survey of sexual behavior and health almost every year. So these studies, there are tons and tons of studies if you want to read about them. But we have learned that, again, sexuality itself is also not a binary, which is something that we want to understand often as a binary. And when we get even more granular, when we're looking at data about sexuality, it's even more complex, and I think somebody who studies this, really interesting. So, for example, there are different ways to survey and understand how people think about sexuality. So one way to survey that's commonly done, for example, Pew does huge data, big studies of people across the US. And they ask people how they identify. So do you identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, asexual? And according to Pew's summer 2022 study, about 7% of Americans identify themselves as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. And that breaks down to, again, we see more younger people identifying that way than older people. But another interesting and important point to make here is that about 0.5 to 1% of the US population considers themselves asexual. So people who are asexual define that in lots of different ways, but typically people who are asexual are not sexually attracted to, or sometimes are sexually attracted to other people, or sexual attraction is not central to how they think about relationships. But again, that's something that people define in lots of different ways for themselves. But so that's the first data, is how do you identify? The second piece of data is when you start to pull that apart, is, like I said, the National Survey of Sexual Health and Behavior, which is run out of the Kinsey Institute, finds that when you ask people about their actual behavior and practices, people who have had same-gender sexual interactions at some point in their life is much higher. So again, broad spectrum of what we're looking at across the United States. So I'm going to turn it over to Maru in just a second, but if you'll go to my last slide, where does that all leave us? Hopefully, it's a lot. Hopefully it helps you to think in more complicated ways about things like sex, sexuality, and gender, and to think about the ways that we're presented these things in the media versus what we know from data and research and studies that helps to contextualize what we're learning and to make it real. These are conversations that are about us. These are things that are about us and our lives and our identity and our development. And so I encourage you to think about your own gender, your own socialization, and think about what you've learned about these concepts. And this is the cycle of socialization to help understand as we learn about different concepts, there are things that we take with us. And if we continue along the cycle of socialization, we'll just keep doing the same things. But it might be helpful for us to also ponder, well, what is not working? What's not working? And how do we make changes? And how do we create a better world where people can experience belonging? Because it is incredibly freeing to live in a world where people can not only identify how we feel and who we are, but actually live and express it. And so I'm going to break at that point and hand it over to Maru to talk about youth development and belonging. I'm going to pull up the slides on here so you can see those.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Maru Gonzalez, and I am so grateful to be a colleague of Annie and to be with you all in dialogue tonight to talk about a really important topic on an important day. It's National Coming Out Day, actually, today. And yesterday was World Mental Health Day. So this is a really relevant time to be talking about this topic. And I'm going to be talking about LGBTQ+ youth belonging specifically, and I think the cycle of socialization is a really perfect segue, because breaking the cycle of socialization and pushing back against some of those messages that we've received and we continue to receive from our family, from institutions, from the media, is really about creating conditions where people can show up and be embraced for exactly who they are. And that's especially true for LGBTQ plus youth. You can go to the next slide, please. All right, so I'll be talking to you all today a little bit about LGBTQ plus youth and belonging. It's a lot of the research I do, is related to this. You can go to the next slide, please. All right, so I want us to kind of take a second and go back to Psych 101, so back deep into your memory banks. If you all remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs, how many of you remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Great, so 80 years ago, Abraham Maslow identified 4 needs that he deemed fundamental to reach the apex of the pyramid, self-actualization, which is essentially reaching our highest potential. Psychological needs, safety needs, and right after that, right after our physiological, rather not psychological, physiological and safety needs have been met, it's belonging. How do you all define belonging? What is belonging? What does it feel like to belong? Because it's a term that we hear kind of thrown around, but what is it? Does anybody just have a word or a phrase they associate with belonging? Acceptance, okay, great. Community. What else? Comfort, yeah, feeling a sense of comfort. What else? Safety, yeah. What does it feel like to belong, to have that sense of belonging? What does that feel like? It's affirmation, right? It's affirmation of who you are, right? What else? What about on the flip side? What does it feel like to feel excluded? To feel like you're in a place and you're like, oh, I don't feel like I belong here. I don't feel affirmed here. I don't feel valued here. What is that like?
Isolation.
Yeah, absolutely. Shame, yeah, brings up feelings of shame and insecurity. Anything else? And if you've ever been in a space, right, where we think about spaces where we feel belonging, right, whether it's in our family, in our workplace, at school, in places of worship, right? We think about that sense of community, that sense of fellowship. And when we feel belonging, we feel like, okay, we believe in ourselves, the people around me believe in me, I feel connected, and we can really, so you can see how it's easier to get to that place of self-actualization. But when we feel a sense of exclusion and isolation and like we're not being affirmed for who we are, right? That creates conditions where we feel discouraged, where feelings of shame and insecurity start to manifest, right? And so why do you think Maslow identified belonging as such a fundamental human need? Because it's not just Maslow, there's a lot of research out there that connects belonging to motivation and creativity and innovation. What do you think it is about belonging that's so fundamental to being human? Will you say more about that? Will you elaborate a little bit more?
Well, I think humans came together, as a group that have had a chance of surviving in the wild.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, we're meant to be part of a community, right? Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
I think humans are built to be in relationships and be in communities and be in families and not be isolated and feel alone.
Right, absolutely. And we thrive, right? We thrive when we feel that sense of community and fellowship and connection, and when we feel valued and affirmed for exactly who we are. You can go to the next slide, please. All right, so the textbook definition of belonging is really what you all already mentioned this. It's the experience of being valued and establishing consistent, meaningful interpersonal relationships within a group. So that sense of being valued and being valued for exactly who you are, and having that be meaningful is really key to belonging. You can go to the next slide. All right, so we'll do a quick activity right now. So I'm going to read this statement, and when I'm done reading the statement, if you agree, I want you to put your thumbs up. If you're kind of like in the middle, do sideways, and then if you disagree, thumbs down. So the statement is, I believe all youth deserve to feel respected, supported, and included. All right. So I think that's a consensus, which is good. And it's meant, right? It's meant, it should, I hope everybody agrees with this statement. And in fact, I've done this activity with different groups, right? Educators, parents, youth serving professionals in rural communities, in urban communities, in conservative communities, and more progressive communities, in Latin America, in the United States, and I've never had anybody either do some thumb sideways or thumbs down, right? Because it's young people, especially, I work a lot with educators and youth serving professionals. They're in that role because they care about youth thriving, right? We all care about youth thriving, and young people deserve to feel respected, supported, and included, and it's a point on which there really is consensus. You can go to the next slide. Oh, sorry. No, that's okay. And ultimately, all youth, and really all people, want and deserve to feel liked, respected, supported, included, and understood. And ultimately, if you want to go to the next slide. Oh, okay, sorry. No, that's okay. I'm not used to the tablet. Only when youth feel safe emotionally as well as physically are they able to present themselves in an authentic manner and engage in positive youth development. So young people's capacity to thrive and to engage in positive youth development is really contingent upon that feeling of safety, that feeling of value, feeling valued and affirmed. And again, that's true for all of us. You can go to the next slide. Unfortunately, however, we don't always, i.e. we, not necessarily the people in this room, but really society, we don't always do a good job of making LGBTQ plus youth feel safe and valued and affirmed and included. And the consequences can be really dire. So 71% of LGBTQ plus youth reported discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender. 39% of LGBTQ plus youth seriously considered attempting suicide in the past 12 months, with more than half of trans and non-binary youth having seriously considered. And this is data that from 2019, so it predates COVID. We know research has told us that we've all heard of the mental health impacts of COVID-19, and those disproportionately impacted LGBTQ plus youth, particularly LGBTQ plus youth who whose parents aren't affirming of them. LGBTQ plus youth who come from highly rejecting families are 8.4 times more likely to have attempted suicide, which is why it's so crucial to create spaces like those in this church, at school, in community organizations that are affirming and that are supportive, particularly for those youth who don't have supportive parents or caregivers. You can go to the next slide. Sorry, I keep doing that.
It's okay.
Okay, sorry. Okay, all right. So LGBTQ plus people of all ages are more likely to experience substance use disorders, suicidality, anxiety, and depression. And you can go to the next slide. And if we zoom in and look at North Carolina specifically, and I should sort of back up and say, most of the research related to LGBTQ plus youth is conducted in schools and not necessarily in community organizations. But this is data from a GLSEN study from 2017, and they found that 90% of LGBTQ plus students in North Carolina hear the word gay used in a negative way. 83% hear homophobic remarks. 87% hear negative remarks about gender expression, and 77% hear negative remarks about transgender people. So that's in North Carolina schools across the board. The data is a little bit different if you sort of look at rural versus urban schools specifically. You can go to the next slide. And I think it's also important to really take into account the political climate in which we're living. So there is a lot of anti-LGBTQ plus legislation currently out there. The ACLU tracks anti-LGBTQ plus bills in the United States. There are currently 501, and there are 11 in North Carolina. And so LGBTQ plus youth are listening to the messages that are being perpetuated out there. They're hearing how their identities are being used as a political football, and it's having an impact on their mental health. You can go to the next slide. So this is data collected from the Trevor Project, and they found that nearly 1 in 3 LGBTQ young people said their mental health was poor most of the time or always due to anti-LGBTQ policies and legislation. And nearly 2 in 3 LGBTQ young people said that hearing about potential state or local laws banning people from discussing LGBTQ people at school made their mental health a lot worse, because you're taking positive messages of affirmation, of support, and you're replacing that with negative and exclusionary messages. You can go to the next slide. Despite these really disheartening statistics, we should also be hopeful, right? Because there's also an overwhelming amount of data that tell us that things like supportive adults and LGBTQ plus inclusive policies and practices really have a positive impact on LGBTQ plus youth. Again, this is, a lot of the research I do is school related. This is data from GLSEN. But it just shows the theory of change, right? So if you have supportive school staff, inclusive curriculum, and effective school safety policies, and you could translate that to any sort of community organization and really just say LGBTQ plus inclusive policies and practices and support and affirmation, that leads to less harassment, less victimization, fewer instances of assault, fewer negative remarks about gender expression, fewer homophobic remarks, an increased sense of safety. And when LGBTQ plus youth experience all that, they're less likely to engage in sexual risk-taking, they're less likely to experience depression, anxiety, their self-esteem improves, their self-image improves, they feel a greater sense of belonging, their GPAs improve, they have an increase in higher education aspirations, and their attendance at school improves. You can go to the next slide. And it's not just within school context, right? This is also true within family contexts as well. So among LGBTQ plus youth, family acceptance and supportive behaviors contribute to a sense of belonging and lead to higher self-esteem, improved mental and physical health, improved academic success, decreased rates of depression, substance abuse, and suicidal ideation. And then if we shift toward looking at places of worship and we look at gender, sexuality, and faith, first we have to recognize that the church hasn't always been, and still a lot of churches aren't open and affirming, right? And religion has historically been used as a tool to divide and oppress. And that includes LGBTQ plus people. And so for a lot of LGBTQ plus people, going to church is still a place of pain. It's a place where they may feel isolated or excluded. And so it's important to acknowledge that that's still the case in a lot of places. It's also important to acknowledge that one can be harmoniously LGBTQ plus and Christian, and we see it all the time, and including in churches like yours who are taking these steps, who are having these series, which is so critically important to increasing that sense of affirmation and belonging. And when LGBTQ plus people feel that sense of affirmation and value and fellowship and community in a place of worship, religion can really be a source of joy, and it can be a source of healing. And religion can also be a protective health factor for most, but not for most LGBTQ plus people of faith. And just sort of piggybacking on what I said earlier, LGBTQ plus Christians are often excluded from religious life, and as such experience higher feelings of depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation than non-LGBTQ plus Christians. Again, which is why a series like these are so crucial. You can go to the next slide. All right, so now I want to talk a little bit about practices for building belonging with LGBTQ plus youth. It says LGBTQ plus youth, but really just practices for building belonging with LGBTQ plus people. So, we talked about earlier, like what makes you feel a sense of belonging, right? And I heard things like affirmation and acceptance and community and fellowship and support and feeling valued. And really, when we think about practices, we don't have to have a PhD, right? Like Annie. Well, I'm just saying, we don't have to be content experts, right? To practice belonging and be supportive, right? We have to be affirming, and we have to value people for who they are and affirm them for who they are, and it's really just as simple as that. That said, sorry.
I'll scroll.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. I will focus on a few things. So first, assessing your biases, taking stock of your personal biases. We all have personal biases. If we, take some time, and hopefully you'll be able to do these in the small groups, and really kind of trace your experience through the cycle of socialization, and think about what messages did I hear growing up from my family about gender, about sexuality? What messages did I grow up, at my school, with my friends, my church, in the media, all of those sorts of things, and just what's still there? What haven't I really kind of addressed or questioned, and spend some time really taking stock of and challenging and addressing those biases that you have. And seeking opportunities for personal development and reflection is really key as well, which is why I'm so glad all of you are here today, because this is an ongoing process, right? It's not even for Annie and I, it's not we do research in this area, so that box is checked, we're good. No, it's an ongoing process. When it comes to learning, we fall short all the time, but the important thing is to just be open and to continue learning and listening. And that's how growth happens. Oh, and then, sorry, next slide. It's confusing when I see it here and then it's not here. Okay, so another key thing is to use gender-affirming language. So referring to trans and gender nonconforming youth and people in general who are trans or gender nonconforming by their chosen name is really, really important, especially when we talk about valuing somebody's and affirming somebody's identity. That really starts by using their name and by using the pronouns that affirm their gender identity. Not making assumptions about a person's gender and or sexual orientation. We see this all the time, oh, do you have a boyfriend? Or, oh, do you have a girlfriend, right? It's just sort of, just rolls off the tongue, and sometimes we don't even realize that we're doing it, but it can feel a little bit exclusionary, especially if that young person or if that older person isn't heterosexual. And then refrain from using terms such as tranny and transvestite. Hopefully you know this already, but those terms are often regarded as pejorative. You can go to the next slide. And there's research out there that shows the impact something so simple like using someone's pronouns or their chosen name can have, right? So research by Russell and colleagues found that using a transgender youth's chosen name at work, at school, with friends, and at home reduces depression symptoms by 71%, reduces thoughts of suicide by 34%, and reduces suicide attempts by 65%. So it's something really small, but it really does show that you're valuing and you're affirming that person for exactly who they are, and that makes such a huge difference. All right, next slide. And then finally, value and include the voices and experiences of LGBTQ plus people. It's important to see, so I do a lot of work in curricula as well, like developing curricula for young people, and we talk about windows and mirrors, right? So windows, when we talk about LGBTQ plus representation, it's important both because it provides a window for people who may not be LGBTQ plus and may not know other people who are LGBTQ plus. You can kind of look through that mirror and see, you know, a different life experience. And then the mirror is also really important and affirming for LGBTQ plus people to see themselves represented, to see themselves reflected, whether that's, you know, at school, whether that's in the media, whether it's here at their church. And so really taking opportunities to value, to include, we're way past the time of don't ask, don't tell, right? And part of valuing and affirming LGBTQ plus people's identities and experiences is by truly valuing and including their voices and experiences. Next slide. And then finally, just being supportive, like I said before, that's huge. And that's it. We have a lot of, so if you scan this QR code, we have a lot of resources there so that you can continue learning. And there are also, I have, if anybody, I don't know if anybody here speaks Spanish or know families who speak Spanish, but I have a booklet. It's bilingual. It's in Spanish and English. It's for parents, caregivers, and loved ones who are primarily Latino, Spanish speaking, and it's just a guide. It's a culturally responsive bilingual guide on how to support an LGBTQ plus young person in your life. So I have those if anybody wants them. If not, you can just have them here in case you know anybody who might need it. But yeah, thank you so much.
Well, and I have to say, Maru, like when I asked Maru to come and do this, because when Chrissy asked me to talk about gender and sexuality, I knew exactly who I wanted to come and do this with me. Maru is, you all don't even know, like she's just so beloved by our students, but also like all over the world for the work that she does around youth and belonging. And she's the best colleague. So Thank you for coming to my church and meeting my friends. You're the best.
Well, I want to say thank you to Drs. Hardison-Moody and Gonzalez for your presentations tonight. I don't know what to do with this either, so. There, I can scroll. Two things that I will leave with tonight. One is, if you would have told me 15 years ago that I'd be sitting in a church fellowship hall on a Wednesday night in 2023 with a room full of people gathered to learn about the social science of gender and sexuality, and that I would turn around and see you all with your smartphones out trying to capture, that is an image I hope to never forget. I wouldn't have believed it if you had told me. Another thing that is striking tonight for me is, for many of us and for me, this conversation often is a question of theology or a question of, well, what do I think about this? Or how do I feel about this? It's a very me-centered question that feels a little privileged when I look at statistics about life and death. So I am walking away heavy with the burden of knowing that using a chosen name or pronoun can reduce suicide by 65%. Is that what you said? I mean, that just, I don't even know what to say about that. Thank you for sharing all of this good information with us, and especially that. Tonight, before we end, I want to express our gratitude for both of you and for the information that you have brought to us tonight, the ways that you are calling us to stretch our own understandings and explore why it is that we've chosen to be here tonight as individuals and as a church community. I know that our time is running short, but I want to remind everybody that part of this journey, when we kicked this thing off, we said we're not just learning with our minds, but we're learning with our souls, and we're learning with our hearts as well. And that's going to require us to go into some spaces that feel new and perhaps uncomfortable. But it's in those spaces that God often meets us and transforms us into the spiritual phrase of new creation. And I think that is what is happening tonight. So I want to name that. You will have an opportunity to process some of the things that you've heard tonight and some of the ways that it works on you with your small groups. I hope everybody has had an opportunity to meet with your small group one time. You'll meet again in 2 weeks. Keep track of your questions. Remember the ones that we ask ourselves periodically throughout this journey. What did I hear that was new tonight? How did it make me feel? And then as time passes, what sticks, what resonates, what continues to tug on me as I move further and further away from that educational gathering? Pay attention to those things, jot them down in your journals, and bring them to your small groups. And as you feel safe, consider sharing some of those things with your friends and companions for the journey. Also want to remind everybody that there is another QR code, not that one, but on the tables behind and on the little music stand next to the camera in the middle of the room. That's the place for you to submit questions. These can be follow-up questions or comments for our facilitators tonight, and it'll take you to a Google form where you can submit those, and the staff will figure out how to get those to Annie and Maru. Yeah, you guys were on time. It's me that's making us late. And then also just a reminder to our small group leaders, we will have 15 minutes of conversation in the Edge Sunday School classroom immediately following our closing prayer. Did I hit all the announcements? And we're going to send, yes, thank you. Much of the text on the slides was too small to read from your seats. We will be sending the slide deck to you in addition to the handout, or to the resources that are on the other end of this QR code that you've already captured on your phone. Okay. So, deep breath. In gratitude for all that has been tonight, and especially with gratitude in the ways that God has shown up in this space, we give thanks. We give thanks to God for each of you, for who you are, and for how you bring that who you are into this community to make us who we are together. We give you thanks, O God. Amen.